Thank you. Good morning. Leaders and delegates, I am very honored, thank you very much, to be here to speak with you. I am the proud son of a retired New York City teacher who was a very active member in the United Federation of Teachers. And at the very young age of 91, she sends her greetings. And she is active in the AFT retiree program. And I said to President Weingarten that you need to be asking more of retirees. I mean, my mother is something. It's interesting, when my father passed away in 2011, my mother became a different person. And there was a side to her that I'd never seen. She is an organizer. She is a leader. She inspires people. And it pointed out a couple things to me. One was how much I am my mother's son. And the other was about patriarchy and about what was suppressed, with all due respect to my father, who I adored, what was suppressed on my mother while my father was alive. And it was a very, very important lesson. And she's just hell on wheels, let me tell you. So I also want to thank you for allowing me to sell my novel. I'm hoping that you buy at least one copy. It was an experience, and I wish I had time to go into that entire experience, but I have a limited amount of time. So I want to get into this. In preparation for this address, I was thinking about the famous Temptation song, Ball of Confusion, from almost 50 years ago, believe it or not, 1970. And the song is remarkable. I think I memorized it. I'm not going to sing it for you. But what was interesting about it is, when I thought about it, the 60s and 70s were not an era of confusion. They were an era of struggle. And you got to just think about it for a second. It was an era of struggle. It was an era of turning things upside down. It was an era of people moving forward, of questioning things. And I want to contrast that with the era that we're living in right now. We are living in an era of uncertainty, what the late theorist Samir Amin described as the empire of chaos. Things that were settled are no longer, countries are disintegrating, climate is changing, and the notion of predictability is out the windows. Lies pass for truth, and truth passes for false news. And it made me think about this scene in one of my favorite films, 3 Days of the Condor, film with Robert Redford, Faye Dunaway, Cliff Robinson, and John Houseman. And there's a scene in that, and if you haven't seen it, even though it came out in the 70s, let me tell you, it is still gripping. There's a scene in there where, Cliff Robinson, who's in the CIA, realizes that there's a covert operation within the CIA, and he's talking with John Houseman, who was his boss, and John Houseman had been a veteran of World War I and World War II, the John Houseman character. And so Cliff Robinson says to him something to the effect of, do you miss the action? And John Houseman replies, no, I miss the clarity. There are moments in history when those entrusted with leadership display no capacity to do so. There are moments when normality becomes abnormal and abnormality becomes normal. And the thing about this moment that we're living in is that we can feel it. We live in a moment, and the nature of the moment frequently paralyzes traditional institutions and movements in whom we have placed our trust. Now, you, teachers and other educational professionals, are a striking exception to this for reasons that I'll get into later. But I want to start with the broader picture of the problem that faces the labor movement. We're in trouble for a whole host of reasons, but in trying to think about how to illustrate the problem, I want you to think about one of the most highly unionized industries in the United States, Major League Baseball. And there's interesting lessons to learn from Major League Baseball. In the 1960s, Major League Baseball players were paid very poorly, with some notable exceptions, but even those, by today's standards, it's unremarkably underpaid. There was something called the reserve clause, which essentially created indentured servitude for ball players. You were stuck with the team that got you unless the owners decided to get rid of you. The players, the union itself, the Major League Baseball Players Association, was a weak professional association. In fact, they didn't want to think of themselves as a union. And then came along two people, a gentleman named Marvin Miller and another one named Curt Flood. Now, Curt Flood was from the St. Louis Cardinals, outfielder, an outstanding player. And one day, the owners decided that they wanted to transfer him, sell him, in effect, to the Philadelphia Phillies. And Flood said, I don't want to go to Philadelphia. I'm not going to go. I'm going to refuse to go. And thus began a lawsuit that wound up in the Supreme Court. Before he went and took the case, though, he went to the Major League Baseball Players Association and spoke with Marvin Miller and other people, like Roberto Clemente, who was one of the leaders. And he basically said, this is what I want to do. Miller said, you have to understand the consequences of doing this. If you do, we will back you. And they did back him. Nevertheless, he lost in the Supreme Court and was essentially driven out of baseball. But his case so shook up Major League Baseball and shook up the country that Marvin Miller developed in a remarkable strategy to get rid of the reserve clause, and I don't have time to go into how he did it, but it was based on building up the strength of the organization, winning the members to understand the importance of getting rid of the reserve clause, making their cause something that people around the country, fans around the country, they embraced, they understood the importance of it. This wasn't just a fight within baseball, it was a fight much broader than that. They positioned the MLBPA to break the reserve clause. And when they did in 1975, as a result of an arbitration decision that completely shocked the owners, there was a dramatic change underway in Major League Baseball. Salaries increased. It was just, absolutely remarkable what happened. The industry grew, but something else happened. The players forgot from whence they came. Baseball lost huge components of its working class base, and particularly African Americans who had been central to baseball in the United States. It became too expensive a game to go to for regular people, for many regular people. To go these days, for a family of 4, you're speaking about at least $100, if not more, to go to a game. Whereas once upon a time, families would just simply, people would take off from work and just go to the game, and that was that. Major League Baseball Players Association thought that they had arrived in the promised land. In fact, they thought that they had arrived at a modus vivendi with the owners. They did not accept the fact that the owners despised the Major League Baseball Players Association and resented the fact that the reserve clause had been destroyed. They continued to try to think, the owners did, about how to get back at the players. And one of the things that they've done is to make sure that Marvin Miller and Curt Flood never entered into the Hall of Fame, despite the fact that those two individuals were fundamental in the transformation of Major League Baseball. But the Players Association forgot that. And then came the 2018 season. And all of a sudden, there was a crisis. There were these free agents, and in the past, there was accepted that these free agents would be getting called upon by different teams, and it wasn't happening. There was some sort of backlog. They were not being called up. There were no deals that were being cut. And the Players Association at that point could not figure out what was going on. Now, yes, this year we've seen a repetition of that, although there are exceptions. Bryce Harper, of course, and then you have the contract extension of Mike Trout. But these are the exceptions. This is not the rule. The industry is changing. And at the opposite end, the minor league baseball players are treated like contemporary agricultural workers. They are poorly paid. I'm talking about under $10,000 a year. They often have to buy their own equipment. They often have to share their apartments in order to live. Food is very limited. The conditions are absolutely abysmal. But the Players Association is not addressing that. The Players Association is stuck. They fail to appreciate that that baseball as an industry would evolve, and that the owners would never accept the existence of a workers' organization. They always thought that they had come to that final agreement. And as the players improved their conditions, they forgot about their fans, and they forgot that the way that the industry itself was changing. They thought that their salaries came not as a result of collective struggle, but they thought that their salaries came because they were great. Instead of a union fighting for the players from sandlot to retirement, instead of a union fighting for the fans, they became, in a word, a special interest. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like union after union around the United States? Unions that began with members who were poor, sometimes multiple jobs, nothing permanent, and it was the union, it was collective action, it was struggle that improved their situation, and all of a sudden, they transformed, they went through this cloud or something, and they became middle class. And they started to identify not with people that they left behind, not with people that they worked with, but they identified with something else, with a whole other echelon. And they started acting like the job of the union was to make sure they stay in the middle class and to hell with the poor people, right? That the job of the union was to basically stabilize the situation and to talk peace with the owners, the employers, and to act as if there had been a final agreement and that the employers had accepted the existence of the union. But in no part of this country do we see any evidence that employers, public or private, have accepted the permanent existence of unions. They just count their time and they wait. They wait for us to display weakness. They wait for a sign of blood, and then they pounce on us. But then came along these pesky teachers and other educational professionals. And you demonstrated a form of unionism that was not only necessary, but in fact possible. Whether we're talking about Los Angeles, Chicago, Milwaukee, whether we're talking about conservative-dominated right-to-work states, the movement of educators pointed in a different direction, in profound direction, a direction of fighting back, a direction of making the issues of the parents and students your issues, of internal education to build the union, of building broad alliances with other forces, and taking risks. Taking risks. Your approach represents a different approach to strategy, and if truly adopted by the rest of the movement, it could place us on the road to a renaissance. And I want to contrast that, and I'm not sure how much time I have left, Josh. How much? Keep going. Keep going. That's what I always love to hear. I want to contrast that with what happened in the federal sector when, and I worked in the federal sector, when Trump carried out his lockout, right? When Trump carried out his lockout, what did the federal sector do? What did the unions do? Well, I mean, they carried, they'd have at least one protest. They encouraged their members to, write Congress, right? They would try to get in the media. And I kept saying, well, like, huh? I mean, is that all? I mean, we're talking about this guy shutting down the government, of driving people to the verge of, if not into bankruptcy. We're talking about the services that people came to depend on, and this is all that the unions could do? I mean, this is all that they could do? I mean, tell me if that, I mean, was I reading something wrong? This is all that they could do when in fact we needed them to stand up, and when we know that the public supports the actual work of the federal sector. When you ask people, do you want food safety inspection? You want to cut that? No, no, no. Do you want TSA to guarantee? Oh, no, 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 we don't. Well, then what do you want us to cut? Well, the fat. Well, what is the fat? There is no fat. The reality is that when these guys in the White House and others are talking about cutting the fat, they're talking about not cutting the fat. They're talking about eliminating the public sector. People get it. Regular people get it. And the question then is, why did the federal sector unions not emulate you? Why did they not make their issue the public's issue, and the public's issue their issue? Why wasn't it that the day after day there should have been protests in front of the White House, in front of Mitch McConnell's office, in Mitch McConnell's office, right? To basically say, no, there will be no normality until we resolve this, right? There will be no civility because you're not being civil. You are destroying our members. You're destroying the public. Why should we display any degree of respect to you? Why should we not be making your life hell? That's what I wanted to hear from the federal sector unions. And that is what you and other teachers and educational professionals around the country have displayed. It's that level of risk of saying in the face of those who say, no, no, you can't strike. You damn right we're going to strike, right? To saying to those that, no, no, you have to be professional. We are being professional. We're upholding our views. We are carrying this out. We're articulating our message. We are absolutely being professional. You're the ones that are trying to destroy us, and we will simply not tolerate it. That is what the federal sector could have learned from you. In the interest of time, there was a whole...
No, you got plenty of time, man.
Oh. Oh. Okay. All right. Here we go then.
Yeah.
I was going to cut a whole section of my speech.
No, keep going.
Okay. Okay. So I talked before about this era that we're living in, and I think what we have to understand is that we do not have endless time. And I'm not just talking about what climate scientists have told us about. We've got basically 12 years. I mean, that needs to be factored into everything else that we do. But I'm talking about that we are up against two significant forces that are trying to destroy us. One is what I'd call the authoritarian corporations, and the other is right-wing populism. And the right-wing populists is what I want to focus on right now, and I know Nancy McClain is going to be addressing you tomorrow, and she'll be going into much more of this. But I want to talk about it because right-wing populism is an infection that exists within this country. I call it the herpes of capitalism. It is an illness that in the body, it surfaces at different times when the body weakens. And in the case of right-wing populism, it surfaces particularly when there's economic and financial crises. And that's when you start to see it emerge. Right-wing populism is a movement against the future. It's represented by people like Donald Trump, but not just by Donald Trump. There's a whole range of forces. It's a movement that is racist, it's misogynist, it is deeply anti-Semitic, it's xenophobic, it's jingoistic. It wishes to burn away the underbrush so that a new crop of racialized capitalism can in fact emerge. Right-wing populism appeals to many of our white members and potential members who feel that their lives are challenged by a decreasing living standard and a very fast-changing technological and cultural norms. It is in this sense that we have to understand that Make America Great Again does not mean Make America Great Again. It begs serious questions. When did it become great? When did it cease to, no really, when did it cease to be great? And what do we mean by great, right? So when did it become great? When did it cease to be great? And what is great? No, so the issue actually is not about greatness. The real meaning behind this is a return to what was, for a significant section of white America, a simpler time. The slogan should really be, "Make America, leave it to Beaver again." It is a return to the 50s. And as Chris Rock once said, many of us have no interest in a return to the 50s. You see, the movement that we've got to represent, the movement that you are leading, it needs to be a movement for the future, not against the future. We must see and face climate change and say, no, we cannot hide from it. We cannot pretend that it will fade away. If we cannot breathe, we will not be able to work. We must have an economy that saves the planet, and we must have jobs that do so. We must have a movement that is unafraid of saying to workers, yes, you are being squeezed. It is not your imagination. You're being squeezed so that the rich can play. We need a movement that says that just because you have a white skin, that does not mean that you have anything in common with the Koch brothers, who in fact despise you and treat you as dirt. We are moving into a dangerous direction. You know, one towards eternal foreign war, environmental disaster, and civil conflict. And when I say civil conflict, let's be clear that right-wing populists are talking on the airwaves about the notion of restarting a civil war. And they don't mean harsh language. It is in that context that we need a renewed labor movement that charts a different course and speaks in the voice of the majority. The voice needs to say, we who stand together shall never be trampled. To win, we need your energy, we need your vision, we need your courage. Thank you very much.